Hello, everyone, and welcome back to U.S. History. This is our third lesson in our series on Reconstruction. This one is titled The South During Reconstruction. We're going to be focusing on Southern life. Now, following the Civil War, the South was in really bad shape, right? They had been beat up during this war. Farms had been burned, governments had collapsed, and following the war, there were roving bands of unemployed soldiers just wandering around the South. If they were hungry, they took your food. If they needed money, they took your money. This was a lawless time in the South. It was really rough. And on top of that, we have war widows all over the place because so many Southerners had died during this conflict. We have widows who want to stay in their home. They want to keep their land, but they find it really difficult to do so without any income. The South is struggling. Now, without land, a Southerner had very little social status, and social status was important in the American South. Most men, African Americans and whites, became tenant farmers and rented their land from others. They couldn't afford to own any land. For African Americans, this is not surprising. Many had just come out of slavery. But many whites were destitute following the war. The economy had been so bad that they'd lost all of their savings, and they also became tenant farmers in the American South. Without currency, without any money that really worked for them, many had to become sharecroppers, where they promised a share of their crops to the landlord, and they got to keep a small share of it to sell for their own living. This is what sharecroppers were, and most former slaves found themselves in the position of being a sharecropper. Now, the Freedmen's Bureau we talked about during our last lesson. In 1865, the federal government created the Freedmen's Bureau. It was directed by General Oliver Howard. Howard University is now named after this individual. And it helped African Americans settle onto land and provide basic health care for them. Keep in mind, these were enslaved individuals. Education was not a thing for enslaved people. In fact, it was illegal in most states to educate a slave. So the Freedmen's Bureau was created to go down and help these people who had not learned how to function in society in these ways. Now, one of the greatest successes of the Freedmen's Bureau was the creation of over 4,300 schools. You heard that number right, 4,300 schools in the South, specifically designed to educate African American children so that the new generation, the next generation of African Americans in the South would not be deprived of knowledge the way their parents had been. Howard University, as I mentioned before, was named for General Howard. It's a very prestigious university in the South. Unfortunately, however, the Freedmen's Bureau was fairly short-lived. It only was around about 7 years before it was ended. Part of the reason why it was ended is resistance in the American South. Many Southern whites struggled with this adjustment. They had their culture, which included slavery, and they were very accustomed to it. And telling them that all of a sudden African Americans were equal to them in their society was a shock and a blow to many people who for their whole life had been taught that that was not true. And in response to these fears of a changing society, the Ku Klux Klan, a terrorist group which still exists today, was created during Reconstruction era. And it worked very hard to eliminate African American rights with the goal of ending Republican rule in the American South. Now, to do this, they did terrorist acts. They killed thousands of people during Reconstruction time. It was quite brutal. Now, in 1868, an interesting thing happens. African Americans are given the right to vote in the American South for the first time, and they realize that they have numbers, and numbers means political power. They overwhelmingly supported General Ulysses S. Grant in this election, which meant in a close election, Grant was able to win largely because of the support of African Americans. And in 1870, the 15th Amendment made sure that voting rights expanded and were protected regardless of race in the United States. According to the 15th Amendment, no one can be denied the right to vote on account of their race. Now, with the vote, many Southern states are able to elect African Americans to public office for the first time in our nation's history. Hiram Revels was the first African American senator, and he represented his state very well. The South will send 20 African Americans to the House of Representatives during that year. So all of a sudden, we've got more representation than we had ever had prior to the Civil War. Now, one representative has an awesome story. I love the story of Robert Smalls. During the war, he steals a Confederate ship. He just sees it in port and sees an opportunity to board it and get out of there with that ship. And he manages to sail out of a southern port and join the Union Navy, where he captains that ship and leads that ship in the war effort against the Confederacy. Now, following the war, we discovered that Smalls also has political skills, and he becomes a very successful politician who serves in Congress until 1887. So he has quite a career in politics. Reconstruction governments. During Reconstruction, Southern scallywags worked with the North to rebuild the Southern economy. These were Southerners, scallywags were, but they were working with the North. And so many Southerners didn't like them. It's like, how dare you help our enemy? But these Southerners saw it in their interest to work with the North to rebuild the economy. Carpetbaggers were Northerners who moved to the South seeing a business opportunity. So they say, hey, you know, the South has been pretty beat up. They're in rough shape. Their economy's in tatters. There's an economic opportunity for me. So I'm going to move my business to the South. These are carpetbaggers. And together, scallywags and carpetbaggers come to control many state governments throughout the South, although they were intensely disliked by former Confederate Southerners. All right, as Reconstruction continued, we wind up heading toward a civil rights showdown. In 1870, Republicans proposed a law to end discrimination in public, to make discrimination, segregation included here, illegal in all public spaces. We will eventually get this law, but it's going to take another 100 years. Now, it's a long fight at that time until the Civil Rights Act of 1875 is eventually passed, and public discrimination based upon race is made illegal. But our Supreme Court, in one of its lousy rulings, and it has a few of them, but this one was a very lousy ruling, called the Civil Rights Act of 1875 unconstitutional. And in 1883, segregation, public displays of racism, once again become legal in the United States. And we do not get the Civil Rights Act to pass again until 1964. Thankfully, that time it stuck. That's all of our lesson for today. Today we covered life in the South after Reconstruction with sharecropping, the Freedmen's Bureau and bringing education to the South, Southern resistance, the KKK, the 15th Amendment, the expansion of voting rights, African Americans getting power in government, and the Civil Rights Showdown. I hope you learned something today, and farewell.